The night before a medieval battle wasn't a dramatic movie moment with big speeches and shiny armor. It was practical, tense, and non-stop work. Camps had to be set up in the right place, guards posted, weapons checked, horses fed, and supplies protected, all while everyone tried to get enough rest to fight at sunrise. And the closer the enemy was, the more that normal camp routine turned into a quiet, controlled countdown. In this video, we're going to walk through what that night really looked like, how medieval soldiers prepared, what worried them most, and what had to go right before anyone even stepped onto the battlefield. Number 1. Choosing the spot. A medieval army didn't just stop for the night anywhere and hope for the best. By late afternoon, commanders and scouts were looking for a place that could keep the army together, feed it, and reduce surprises. Water mattered first. Thousands of people and animals needed drinking water, and if you were marching with horses, pack animals, and carts, you couldn't camp far from a reliable source. But water was also a risk, because rivers, ponds, and marshy ground could trap troops or make the camp unhealthy, so they tried to pick higher, drier ground near water rather than right on top of it. The second big issue was visibility. An army wanted to see approaches and avoid being boxed in by woods, hedges, steep slopes, or narrow lanes. If the enemy was close, the camp might be set back behind a natural obstacle, like a ridge, with clear ground in front for warning and for forming up quickly. Then there was the question of space and order. A mixed medieval force included nobles and their households, men-at-arms, infantry, archers, wagon crews, servants, craftsmen, and traders. Even a small force could spread out fast if it wasn't controlled. So leaders tried to keep units grouped under their banners, because in battle you didn't want people waking up scattered and confused about where to assemble. If the army expected a fight at dawn, the camp placement was already a part of the battle plan. Where the main body would form, where archers would stand, which direction cavalry could move, and how the baggage and non-combatants would be protected. In friendly territory, the camp might be a village, barns, a monastery guest house, or a walled town if one was available. In hostile territory, it was more likely open ground with a tighter, more guarded layout, because the army couldn't assume locals would help or even stay neutral. When people picture medieval war, they often imagine two neat armies facing each other in daylight with everything settled. The reality is that the night before battle was already full of decisions about terrain, movement, and control, because one bad camping choice could mean starting the next day thirsty, disorganized, or surprised before anyone even formed a line. Number 2. Setting the camp order. Once the spot was chosen, the next question was how to arrange the camp so it didn't turn into a crowd. Medieval armies were not uniform machines, but they did use structure. Lords, captains, and banner groups acted like anchors. A banner wasn't just decoration, it was a navigation tool. In low light, noise, and confusion, people needed a clear reference for where am I supposed to be? So tents and shelters clustered around leaders and their immediate households, and the rest of the unit stayed close enough to gather fast. The most valuable and vulnerable things, the baggage wagons, spare equipment, supplies, and sometimes families and hired workers, had to be placed with some thought. Many armies used the baggage as part of the camp's physical boundary, like a rough barrier, not a perfect wall, but enough to slow sudden intruders and channel movement. If the army had time and feared a night attack, they might add earthworks, a ditch, or simple obstacles. Not every army did this every time. It depended on time, tools, and discipline. But even without digging, they could create edges by using wagons, ropes, and the natural terrain so that strangers couldn't just walk in from any direction unnoticed. Fires were another issue. People needed warmth, cooking, and light, but fires also made you visible and could create chaos if they spread. In some situations, leaders limited fires or pushed them into controlled areas. Noise control mattered too. If you're close to an enemy, you want your camp quiet enough to hear movement, and you don't want to advertise confusion. This is where discipline shows up. A professional or semi-professional force, men-at-arms under contract, mercenaries, experienced town militias, tended to keep better camp order than a rushed feudal levy called up for short service. The night before battle was also when commanders tried to prevent the simplest, most common problems. People wandering off to forage and getting captured, arguments turning into fights, units losing track of their positions, and horses being mishandled. A medieval camp was a living thing. Cooking smoke, repairs, prayer, quiet conversations, guards calling out, and messengers moving between leaders. It wasn't glamorous, but it was where an army either stayed coherent or slowly came apart. Number 3. Guard duty and early warning. The most serious job that night wasn't polishing armor or sharpening a blade. It was keeping watch. Night attacks happened, and even when they didn't, raids and scouting probes were common. An enemy might try to burn wagons, steal horses, capture important people, or simply cause panic. Medieval commanders knew panic could do as much damage as weapons, so they relied on layered warning. Scouts out front, pickets or sentries posted at approaches, and guards inside the camp to control movement. If the army had cavalry or mounted scouts, those riders were valuable for patrolling the edges and checking roads, river crossings, and nearby woods. Where terrain funneled movement, bridges, gates of a town, narrow paths, those points mattered most, because they were the likely routes for an enemy to slip in. A watch system also helped with internal control. A camp at night is full of people who have reasons to move around: fetching water, finding a captain, checking horses, carrying messages. Without some system, that movement looks the same as an intruder. So armies often used passwords, countersigns, or recognizable calls. They also kept certain lanes clearer so that messengers and officers could move quickly without tripping through crowded spaces. Another part people forget is that security included controlling the army's own foraging and looting. In enemy territory, hungry troops might drift out to find food, and that could lead to ambushes or cause units to be missing at dawn. Experienced leaders tried to keep parties organized, sent out with a purpose, and brought back before dark if possible. There was also a practical detail. Guard duty is exhausting. A commander had to rotate watches so people were not all exhausted at dawn. That meant deciding who sleeps early, who stays awake, and who gets woken later. If a battle was expected the next day, many soldiers tried to rest, but rest was uneven. Sentries stayed alert, officers stayed busy, and anyone near the camp edge slept lighter. And because medieval armies were social hierarchies, the pattern was unequal. A noble and his closest men might have a tent and assigned guards, while an ordinary infantryman slept on the ground with a cloak, hoping the weather stayed calm and no one stepped on him in the dark. Number 4. Weapons, armor, and the quiet maintenance. The night before battle was one long maintenance check, because medieval equipment worked only as well as the last person who cared for it. This is where the real prep shows up, and it's more about small tasks than dramatic speeches. For archers, the priority was protecting bowstrings from damp. A wet string loses performance and reliability, so strings were kept dry, sometimes carried inside clothing or wrapped carefully. Arrows were checked, straightness, fletching, points seated properly. If supplies allowed, damaged arrows were repaired, and extra sheaves were placed where they could be reached quickly in the morning. Crossbowmen had their own checklist: spanning gear, strings, triggers, bolts, and the condition of the bow itself. Crossbows could be powerful, but were also mechanical systems. You didn't want a bad catch or a frayed string when it mattered. For men-at-arms and knights, the work looked like cleaning and checking fastenings. Mail links and rivets were inspected for gaps. In the later Middle Ages, plate armor meant straps, buckles, and arming points, laces that tied armor to a padded garment. Those points could break, and a missing tie could mean a piece sits wrong, shifts, or becomes a distraction. Squires or servants handled a lot of this labor, but not everyone had that support. Many soldiers did their own repairs or traded help within the group. Blades were sharpened, but sharp wasn't the whole story. Edges needed the right angle, and weapons needed to be straight and secure at the hilt.
Spears and polearms were checked for tight heads and solid shafts, because a loose head is a failure waiting to happen. Shields were also maintained: straps, grips, and edges. A shield is a tool that takes repeated impact, so a cracked rim or weakened strap could end it quickly. There's a common myth that knights slept in full armor the night before battle. Sometimes a soldier might keep key pieces on if there was real fear of a night alarm, but full harness was heavy, uncomfortable, and risky for rest. More often, armor was laid out ready, with the padded layer worn or kept close, and with a plan for how to get dressed quickly with help. The arming process in the morning could take time, so the night before was when you made sure every piece was accounted for and placed where you could reach it fast, even in dim light. That's the feel of the camp. Not constant action, but a steady rhythm of checking, wiping, tightening, and setting things in order so that tomorrow starts with fewer surprises.
Number 5. Horses and mobility. If the army had significant cavalry or mounted men-at-arms, the night before battle was also about horses. And horses were not just transport. In medieval warfare, a good horse could be a major investment, and losing one could end a soldier's effectiveness. So grooms and riders focused on feeding, watering, and calming animals in a crowded, noisy environment. Horses need forage and grain, and that creates a whole supply chain of hay, oats, sacks, and storage. If supplies were tight, the mood in camp changed quickly because hungry animals and tired people both become harder to manage. Tack was checked: saddles, girths, bridles, bits, stirrup leathers. A loose girth or broken strap could throw a rider at the worst moment. Hooves mattered too. Farriers and basic hoof care were part of medieval campaigning because long marches damage hooves and shoes can loosen. If you're expecting a battle, you want mounts as fresh as possible, so riders might minimize unnecessary movement that evening. There's also the question of how close horses were kept. In a calm camp, mounts might be tethered in organized lines near their owners' positions. In a tense camp, close to the enemy, horses might be kept even closer and guarded more heavily, because a quick raid aimed at stealing or scattering horses could cripple a force. Some armies used ropes or picket lines. Others used portable fences or simply tight grouping and guards. And while Hollywood often focuses on the knight's armor, the horse's protection was also a topic in many periods. Depending on time and wealth, some horses had protective coverings. But even without armor, the care routine mattered. Check for sores from harness, keep the animal as dry as possible, and avoid exhausting it before it's needed. Mobility planning also happened around the horses. Scouts who would ride before dawn
needed to be ready quietly.
Messengers needed fresh mounts to carry orders between sections of the army or back to Allied forces. If the commander planned a flanking move at first light, those units had to know where to assemble and how to move without tangling with the baggage. So the stable work at night wasn't separate from strategy. It was part of making the army able to move as an organized body, not just a crowd with weapons. Number 6. Food, water, and the unromantic logistics. A medieval army's night before battle was full of basic needs, and these needs shaped morale more than speeches did. People needed calories, and not just a symbolic meal. Campaign diets varied, but common elements were bread, grains, cheese, salted meat, dried fish in some regions, beans or peas, and whatever could be gathered locally. If the army was supplied well, the evening meal could be steady and predictable. If supplies were thin, you'd see more foraging, more bargaining with locals, and more arguments. Cooking was typically simple, because you're feeding many people with limited gear. Fires were clustered, pots were shared, and some soldiers ate cold rations to avoid the time and smoke. Water parties were organized if the source wasn't right next to camp. And because water sources could be contested, guarded, or simply muddy, this wasn't always easy. Then there's the baggage train. Medieval armies moved with wagons carrying tents, spare weapons, food, tools, cooking gear, and personal kit. Those wagons were slow and vulnerable, and in the evening they had to be positioned so they didn't block movement, but also didn't sit unprotected. The people who handled the baggage, drivers, servants, hired workers, were not background characters. They were essential to whether the army could function the next day. If you lose cooking gear, you don't eat. If you lose spare bowstrings, you lose shooting capacity. If you lose tent cloth in bad weather, rest gets worse.
Even small things mattered. Spare shoes, needles and thread for repairs, simple tools for tightening fittings. On top of that, the camp included merchants and tradespeople selling food, drink, and small gear at a markup. This wasn't a modern supply system. It was a moving market tied to the army. Prices and access depended on rank and money, which meant inequality showed up even in dinner. Officers and wealthy men ate better and stayed drier. Ordinary soldiers ate what they had, shared when they could, and hoped the morning didn't start with hunger. That's why commanders tried to enforce order around supplies. A hungry, tired soldier is less disciplined, slower to respond, and more likely to break formation. So, the night before battle was also an attempt to put the whole force into a stable condition, fed enough, watered enough, and organized enough to move on command.
Number 7. Mindset, religion, and discipline. Mentally, the night before battle wasn't one single emotion. It was a mix of focus, tension, routine, and private fear. Medieval people lived closer to violence and uncertainty than many modern audiences do, but that didn't make them immune to stress. The difference is how they handled it. Religion played a central role in many European armies. Priests and chaplains were present in many campaigns, and before a major fight, prayer services, blessings, and confession were common. This wasn't just personal comfort, it was social cohesion. Shared ritual helped people feel that tomorrow had meaning and that they belonged to a cause bigger than themselves. Leaders also used religious language to frame discipline and courage because it was a common vocabulary that most people understood. Alongside that, there were practical steps tied to belief. Making peace with rivals inside the camp, settling debts if possible, writing short wills or letters when someone had the means, and arranging what would happen if a man fell or was captured. It's important to say this plainly. Medieval warfare involved capture and ransom among the wealthy, and that shaped behavior.
A noble might think in terms of status and negotiation, while an ordinary foot soldier expected a harsher fate if things went badly. That difference affected morale and risk-taking. Discipline also tightened. Camp rules could be stricter on a pre-battle night. Limits on leaving camp, restrictions on alcohol depending on the commander, and penalties for fighting or theft inside the lines. Not every army enforced this well, but effective leaders tried, because disorder at night turns into confusion at dawn. Orders moved through the camp, where to assemble, which banner to follow, when to wake, what signal would start the formation. Officers checked their people, counted them, and made sure key specialists, archers, engineers, scouts were in place.
You could also see the social hierarchy in how people prepared mentally. Knights and men-at-arms might have time with their households, quiet preparation with squires, and private prayer in a tent. Common infantry prepared in groups, leaning on routine. Check gear, eat, sleep if possible, wake when called. The atmosphere wasn't a movie scene with dramatic speeches everywhere. Most of the time it was practical talk, short instructions, and people trying to keep their hands busy so their minds didn't spiral. Number 8. The pre-dawn setup. The last stretch of the night before battle blends into the first hours of the battle day because medieval armies often tried to be moving before sunrise. You didn't want to be surprised while half-dressed or still searching for a missing strap. So, well before first light, the camp began to shift. Fires were stirred carefully or kept low. People woke in stages, depending on watch rotations and unit roles. Archers and crossbowmen checked their strings again because damp night air could change everything. Men-at-arms started dressing in layers, padded garments first, then mail if they had it, then plates, with help if available. The key here is speed without chaos. If you rush and buckle the wrong strap or miss an arming point, you spend the first minutes of battle distracted and vulnerable. So experienced groups had a routine. The same order every time, the same places for gear, the same person responsible for each item if you had support. Horses were saddled early, so the line didn't become a knot of animals and people at the last second. Commanders and heralds made sure banners were visible because those symbols were how units aligned and how messengers found the right captain. Scouts might be sent out again to confirm the enemy's position and movement because what was true at dusk might not be true by dawn. If the enemy camped nearby, both sides were doing this at the same time, which meant the hours before sunrise could be tense but quiet, with everyone listening for unusual movement. Then the army began to form. Not all medieval battles started with two perfect lines. Sometimes it was a scramble into a rough order that improved as leaders shouted and flags moved into place. But the whole point of the night's preparation was to reduce that scramble, to know where to gather, which group goes where, who holds the baggage, who stays with the commander, who takes the first forward position. Even the simplest details mattered, like agreeing on the signal for movement, horn, drum, shouted call, banner motion, and making sure it would be understood across accents and noise. As the sky lightened, the camp stopped being a place to live for the night and became a staging area. Food packed away, spare gear secured, non-combatants pushed to safer positions, and fighters stepping into the roles they'd been rehearsing in small ways since the evening before.